On the morning of March 15, 1942, somewhere over the gray-green fields of wartime England, a young American bombardier named Technical Sergeant James Robert Mitchell stood proudly before his B-17 Flying Fortress, unaware that the photograph being taken would, 80 years later, become one of the most debated images in military history. The leather of his flight jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, his cap tilted at the regulation angle, his face bearing that particular expression of youthful confidence mixed with the somber awareness that many who flew in these machines never returned. Behind him, the massive bomber gleamed in the weak morning sunlight, its aluminum skin reflecting the clouds that would soon swallow it whole on yet another mission over occupied Europe. The photographer, a harried Army Signal Corps corporal whose name has been lost to history, clicked the shutter of his speed graphic camera, captured the image on film, and moved on to the next airman in line. It was routine work, the kind of documentation that filled thousands upon thousands of boxes in military archives. The photograph was developed, filed away in a manila envelope marked 391st Bombardment Group Personnel Records, and forgotten for more than 7 decades. In late October 2021, a team of digital restoration experts at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, began an ambitious project to digitize and restore photographs from World War II. The initiative, according to a report published in the Washington Post that November, aimed to preserve deteriorating images using cutting-edge artificial intelligence and high-resolution scanning technology. Dr. Elizabeth Brennan, the project's lead historian, had processed hundreds of images without incident when she loaded Sergeant Mitchell's photograph into the restoration software. What happened next would consume her professional life for the next 2 years. The AI-enhanced restoration process worked by analyzing damaged portions of photographs and intelligently filling in missing details based on patterns in the surrounding areas. It had successfully restored countless images of soldiers, sailors, and airmen from the war years. But when the algorithm finished processing Mitchell's photograph, Dr. Brennan found herself staring at her monitor in confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching fear. There, clearly visible in the restored image where nothing but darkness had been apparent in the original, was something that should not exist. Behind Sergeant Mitchell, partially obscured by the bomber's tail section, but unmistakable once revealed, stood another figure. This in itself would not have been remarkable. Photographs often contained unexpected subjects in the background, but this figure wore no uniform that Dr. Brennan recognized. The clothing appeared civilian, modern even, and most disturbing of all, the person seemed to be holding something up to their face, something small and rectangular, something that looked exactly like a smartphone. Dr. Brennan's first instinct was that the restoration software had malfunctioned, perhaps pulling imagery from its training database and inserting it where it did not belong. She ran the process again. The figure remained. She processed the original negative using different software. The figure was still there, fainter but present. She examined the physical negative itself under magnification. The figure existed in the original image, barely visible in the underexposed background, but definitely there in 1942. Within days, Dr. Brennan had assembled a small team of experts sworn to secrecy. They included forensic photograph analysts, material scientists who could date film composition, and even a physicist who specialized in temporal anomalies, though she had laughed nervously when asked if time travel might be involved. The team worked methodically, ruling out explanations one by one. The negative showed no signs of tampering. The chemical composition matched other authenticated negatives from the same batch and period. The figure was not a shadow, not a reflection, not a trick of light or development. Someone dressed in 21st century clothing, apparently holding a modern device, had been standing on that airfield in England in 1942. As word of the anomalous photograph spread quietly through academic circles in early 2022, researchers began investigating the life of Technical Sergeant James Robert Mitchell with unprecedented thoroughness. Military records revealed that he had been born on July 9, 1921, in a small farming community outside Topeka, Kansas, the second of 4 sons born to Robert Earl Mitchell and his wife Dorothy May. Young James had been, by all accounts, an unremarkable child who became an unremarkable teenager who joined an unremarkable tide of young American men, swept into the machinery of global war. Mitchell had enlisted in the Army Air Forces in December 1941, mere days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. His recruitment papers, discovered in a dusty filing cabinet at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, showed that he stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed 168 pounds, and had passed his physical examination with no notable deficiencies. He had completed basic training at Shepherd Field in Texas, then bombardier school at Midland Army Flying School. His instructor's notes described him as competent and reliable, neither exceptional nor deficient. He had arrived in England in February 1942 as part of the first wave of American bomber crews, preparing for what would become the sustained strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The 391st Bombardment Group, to which he was assigned, operated B-17 bombers from RAF Framingham in Suffolk. The photograph in question had been taken during one of the unit's first weeks of operations, before the terrible losses that would later define the bomber offensive. What happened to Mitchell after that March morning became the subject of intense scrutiny. Flight records showed that he had participated in 11 combat missions between March and June of 1942. His 12th mission, flown on June 23, 1942, targeting German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in occupied France, was his last. The mission had been particularly brutal. Of the 18 bombers that took off that morning, only 11 returned. Mitchell's plane, nicknamed Dakota Queen, was not among them. According to debriefing reports from surviving crew members of other aircraft, Dakota Queen had been hit by anti-aircraft fire over the target. Witnesses saw the bomber's No. 3 engine catch fire, then watched as the aircraft began losing altitude. Some reported seeing parachutes, but in the chaos of combat, no one could say for certain how many crew members had escaped. The bomber had disappeared into clouds over the Bay of Biscay. Neither the aircraft nor any of its crew were ever recovered. Mitchell had been officially listed as missing in action, then later declared dead as of June 24, 1943, 1 year and 1 day after his final mission. His mother, Dorothy, received the telegram every military family dreaded. His personal effects, including his letters home and a small leather Bible, were returned to his family in Kansas. His name was eventually inscribed on the tablets of the missing at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, alongside more than 5,000 other American servicemen who have no known graves. For 79 years, that had been the end of James Mitchell's story. A young man who served, who fought, who died somewhere over the cold waters of the Atlantic, his sacrifice noted in the grand statistics of war, but his individual life fading into the vast anonymity of history. But then came the photograph. Dr. Brennan's team began interviewing the few surviving veterans who had served with Mitchell, though by 2022, precious few remained alive. They found Franklin Delano Cooper, a former ball turret gunner who had lived in the same barracks as Mitchell. Cooper, then 100 years old and residing in an assisted living facility in Florida, remembered Mitchell as quiet, homesick, and deeply worried about a younger brother still fighting in the Pacific. "Jimmy used to talk about Kansas like it was paradise," Cooper recalled in a videotaped interview conducted in March 2022. Wheat fields and thunderstorms and his mother's cooking. He showed me a picture once of his girlfriend, name of Sarah or Susan or something with an S. He said he was going to marry her when the war ended, buy a farm, raise children who would never have to know what war was like. Cooper paused, his ancient eyes distant. He never got that chance. None of that generation really got what they wanted, did they? We all came home different, those of us who came home at all. But there was something else Cooper mentioned, something that made Dr. Brennan lean forward in her chair. "There was one odd thing about Jimmy," the old veteran said. "He used to have these, what did he call them? Spells, I think. He'd get this look on his face like he was somewhere else entirely. Sometimes he'd say things that didn't make sense, like he'd been somewhere we hadn't been, seen things we hadn't seen. We just figured it was nerves. Everyone got strange before a mission." The research team pressed for more details, but Cooper's memory, sharp as it was for a centenarian, could provide nothing more concrete. Just an impression of strangeness, a sense that James Mitchell had been carrying some burden beyond the ordinary terror of flying combat missions into hostile skies. By late spring of 2022, Dr. Brennan's small team had grown into a multidisciplinary task force of nearly 20 researchers, though their work remained largely unknown to the public. The team included Dr. Harold Chen, a forensic imaging specialist from MIT who had worked on authenticating historical photographs for the FBI, Dr. Sarah Goldstein, a materials scientist from the Smithsonian Institution who specialized in dating photographic materials, and Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist from CERN who had published controversial papers on theoretical temporal mechanics, what the popular press might call time travel, though no serious physicist would use such crude terminology. The investigation proceeded along multiple parallel tracks, each designed to either explain the anomaly through conventional means or progressively eliminate mundane explanations until only the extraordinary remained. Dr. Chen began with the most fundamental question. Was the photograph genuine or had it been tampered with at some point during its 80-year existence? Modern photograph forgery had become increasingly sophisticated with digital tools. But the Mitchell photograph predated the digital age by decades. Any tampering would have required physical manipulation of the negative itself. Chen subjected the negative to every analytical technique available to modern forensic science. He examined it under various wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. He used scanning electron microscopy to analyze the grain structure of the film emulsion. He employed X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to map the chemical composition of the developed silver particles. His conclusion, delivered in a 43-page technical report that June, was unequivocal. The negative was genuine and unaltered. The mysterious figure in the background had been present when the photograph was taken in 1942. I have examined this negative with every tool available to modern forensic science, Chen wrote in his summary. I find no evidence of double exposure, physical manipulation, or any other form of tampering. The image is consistent with a single exposure made on period-appropriate film stock under natural lighting conditions. The figure in question is not a later addition, but was present at the scene when the photograph was taken. Dr. Goldstein's materials analysis supported Chen's findings. She had carefully extracted microscopic samples from the edges of the negative and subjected them to radiocarbon dating and chemical composition analysis. The film base was cellulose nitrate, the standard for photographic negatives in the early 1940s. The chemical signature of the developing agents matched samples from other authenticated photographs from the same period and location. Isotopic analysis of the silver halide crystals showed ratios consistent with materials manufactured in the United States between 1938 and 1945. There is no possibility that this negative was created after 1945, Goldstein reported. The materials are period appropriate and show aging consistent with 80 years of storage. This photograph was taken when and where military records indicate it was taken. The team's attention then turned to the figure itself. High-resolution scans of the enhanced image revealed details that became more disturbing the more closely they were examined. The figure stood approximately 40 feet behind Sergeant Mitchell, partially obscured by the tail section of the bomber. The clothing was clearly civilian and contemporary, or rather, contemporary to the 21st century, not the 1940s. What appeared to be jeans or similar casual pants, a jacket of indeterminate style, and most prominently the rectangular object held up at face level. Dr. Brennan brought in Dr. Jennifer Wu, a cultural historian specializing in material culture and technology. Wu examined the enhanced images for hours, comparing the object to historical photographs of cameras and other devices from the 1940s. Her conclusion was delivered with careful academic caution, but her underlying unease was evident. The object's proportions, the way it's being held, the posture of the person holding it, all of this is consistent with someone taking a photograph or video with a modern smartphone, Wu explained during a team meeting in July 2022. The stance is identical to what we see millions of times daily in contemporary life. Someone standing with their arm extended, the device held at face level, oriented horizontally. But in 1942, cameras were substantially larger and held differently. Even small cameras like the Kodak Retina would have been held at chest level, with the photographer looking down into a viewfinder. Dr. Webb, the theoretical physicist, had remained largely silent during the first months of investigation. But as conventional explanations were systematically eliminated, the team increasingly turned to him for guidance into the uncomfortable realm of temporal anomalies. Webb approached the problem with the caution of a scientist who knew that his field of study existed at the boundary between legitimate physics and scientific speculation. "Let me be absolutely clear," Webb told the assembled team during a presentation in August 2022. "I am not saying that time travel is possible. I am saying that our current understanding of physics does not absolutely forbid certain types of temporal displacement under extremely specific, and likely impossible, conditions. The mathematics allows for closed time-like curves in certain space-time geometries. Whether these solutions represent physical reality or are merely mathematical curiosities is an open question." While the scientific investigation proceeded through the summer of 2022, another member of Dr. Brennan's team pursued a different line of inquiry. Dr. Robert Yamamoto, a genealogist and family historian from the University of Pennsylvania, began tracing the descendants of Technical Sergeant James Robert Mitchell. The task proved more challenging than anticipated, primarily because Mitchell had died unmarried and childless. However, his 3 brothers had survived the war and produced numerous offspring. By September 2022, Yamamoto had constructed a comprehensive family tree encompassing more than 200 living descendants of the Mitchell family. Most were scattered across the American Midwest, ordinary citizens living ordinary lives, completely unaware that their relative's photograph had become the subject of intense scientific scrutiny. Yamamoto began the delicate process of contacting these descendants, initially with vague inquiries about family history and photographs. One name on Yamamoto's list stood out: Dr. Thomas Mitchell, aged 47, a software engineer living in Portland, Oregon. Thomas was the great-grandson of James Mitchell's older brother, Walter. What caught Yamamoto's attention was Thomas's profession and his hobby. According to his public social media profiles and professional website, Thomas Mitchell specialized in digital restoration and artificial intelligence applications for historical preservation. He had published several papers on machine learning techniques for enhancing degraded photographs. And according to his personal blog, he had been obsessed with World War II history since childhood, particularly the 8th Air Force bomber campaign. Yamamoto brought this information to Dr. Brennan in late September. Within days, they had arranged a meeting with Thomas Mitchell, though they carefully avoided revealing the specific nature of their interest in his family history. The meeting took place in a nondescript conference room at the National Archives in October 2022. Thomas Mitchell arrived carrying a worn leather satchel and an air of barely contained enthusiasm. He was tall and thin, with sandy hair graying at the temples and wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly adjusted. He reminded Dr. Brennan uncomfortably of photographs she had seen of young James Mitchell. The same basic facial structure, the same slightly awkward stance. "I've been researching my family's military history for years," Thomas explained as the meeting began. "My great-great-uncle James was killed in action in June of 1942. I've collected everything I could find about him and his unit. Service records, mission reports, photographs. It's become something of an obsession, I suppose. My way of honoring his sacrifice." Dr. Brennan exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Mr. Mitchell, we'd like to show you a photograph. We need you to tell us if you've seen it before and, more importantly, if you recognize anything unusual about it." They presented him with a high-resolution print of the restored image, carefully showing first only Sergeant Mitchell himself, not the background. Thomas studied it with the intensity of someone who had examined countless similar images. "That's him," Thomas said softly. "That's James. I've seen other photographs of him, but not this particular one. The quality is remarkable, much better than most images from that period. When was this taken?" "March 15, 1942, Dr. Brennan replied. "But before we discuss the photograph further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever visited England? Specifically, have you ever visited the site of RAF Framingham where your great-great-uncle was stationed?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, actually. I went there about 3 years ago, October of 2019. It was a personal pilgrimage of sorts. Most of the original base is gone now, It's farmland again. But there's a memorial there and a small museum in the nearby village. I spent several days in the area, visiting the memorial, the cemetery, trying to get a sense of what James's life had been like during those last months. While you were there, Dr. Brennan continued carefully, did you take photographs? Of course. Hundreds of them. On my phone mainly. I documented everything, the memorial, the surrounding countryside, even the few remaining structures from the wartime base. Dr. Brennan felt her heart rate accelerate. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to show you the complete photograph now, including the background. I need you to look very carefully and tell us what you see. She presented the full enhanced image. Thomas studied it in silence for nearly a minute. Then his face went pale. His hands holding the photograph began to tremble slightly. That's not possible, he whispered. What do you see? Dr. Brennan asked, though she already knew the answer. That's me, Thomas said, his voice barely audible. In the background, that's me. I'm wearing the jacket I wore on that trip, and I'm holding my phone up, taking a picture, exactly like I did hundreds of times when I was there. The silence in the conference room stretched for long seconds. Finally, Dr. Yamamoto spoke. Mr. Mitchell, the photograph you're looking at was taken on March 15, 1942. You weren't born until 1975. Can you explain how you could appear in a photograph taken 33 years before your birth? Thomas Mitchell stared at the photograph, then at the assembled researchers, then back at the photograph. No, he finally said. No, I cannot explain it. But that is definitely me. I recognize everything, my jacket, my phone, even my stance. I take pictures like that all the time. But in 2019, there was no B-17 bomber there. No airmen, just empty fields and the memorial. The revelation that Thomas Mitchell recognized himself in the photograph sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. Dr. Brennan's team expanded once more, now including specialists in parapsychology, quantum mechanics, and even theoretical historians who studied what they called temporal anomalies in documented history. The research took on an urgency that transcended academic curiosity. They were no longer merely studying an interesting photographic anomaly. They were confronting evidence that suggested the fundamental nature of time and causality might be more complex than conventional physics allowed. Thomas Mitchell became both a research subject and a collaborative member of the investigation. Over the following weeks, he provided the team with his complete photographic record from his 2019 visit to England. There were, as he had indicated, hundreds of images. The team meticulously examined each one, looking for any reciprocal anomaly, any image from 2019 that might show evidence of the 1942 airfield and its aircraft. They found nothing definitive. Thomas's photographs showed exactly what one would expect: a peaceful English countryside, the memorial to the 391st Bombardment Group, the small museum, and the surrounding farms. No ghostly B-17 bombers. No phantom airmen from the past. Just modern rural England in autumn. But then Dr. Chen noticed something. In one of Thomas's photographs taken at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on October 12, 2019, there was an odd quality to the light. The image showed the memorial stone with its inscription honoring the fallen airmen. The lighting suggested late afternoon autumn sun, which matched the metadata from the photograph. But in the left edge of the frame, barely visible, was what appeared to be a shadow, a long, angular shadow that Chen identified as potentially consistent with the tail section of a large aircraft. Look at the angle, Chen explained to the team, projecting the image onto a large screen. Shadows at that time of day and that season should extend toward the northeast. This shadow extends toward the south. That's wrong for the natural lighting conditions. But if there had been a large object blocking the sun from a different angle, from a different time of day, or even from a different time period entirely, he let the implication hang in the air. Dr. Webb, the physicist, studied the image intently. Are you suggesting that at the moment Thomas Mitchell took this photograph in 2019, somehow the light from 1942 leaked through into his image? That's beyond speculative. That's borderline impossible. Yet here we are. Dr. Brennan said quietly, discussing how Thomas Mitchell appeared in a photograph taken 33 years before his birth. We've already crossed the boundary into the impossible. The question is not whether impossible things happened, but how and why. The team decided to pursue a more systematic approach. Dr. Yamamoto conducted extensive interviews with Thomas, trying to uncover any unusual experiences during his 2019 visit to England. At first, Thomas insisted that the trip had been entirely ordinary, just a history enthusiast visiting a location significant to his family's past. But as Yamamoto pressed for details, certain elements began to emerge that Thomas had initially dismissed as insignificant. On October 12, 2019, the same date as the photograph with the anomalous shadow, Thomas had experienced what he described as a strange moment while standing near the memorial. It was late afternoon, Thomas recalled during an interview session in November 2022. The sun was getting low. I was alone there. The museum had just closed, and most of the other visitors had left. I was standing by the memorial stone, trying to imagine what the airfield would have looked like during the war. And then, it's hard to describe. For just a moment, maybe a second or two, I could have sworn I heard aircraft engines. That deep, rumbling sound that big radial engines make. I even looked up thinking maybe there was a vintage aircraft flying over. They sometimes do airshow flights in that area. But there was nothing, Yamamoto prompted. Nothing in the sky, Thomas confirmed. But the sound was so clear, so real. And there was something else. A smell, just for an instant. High-octane aviation fuel and exhaust. Very distinctive. I used to work at an air show when I was younger, so I know that smell. But it was there and then it was gone, and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Thomas paused, a troubled expression crossing his face. And there was one more thing, a feeling, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. I turned around several times, thinking another visitor had arrived, but there was never anyone there. I felt foolish, so I didn't mention it in the journal I kept of the trip. It seemed like the kind of thing that would sound ridiculous if I wrote it down. Dr. Webb found this account particularly significant. He spent several days reviewing the scientific literature on temporal anomalies, quantum mechanics, and theoretical models of time. In mid-November, he presented a hypothesis to the team that was simultaneously elegant and deeply unsettling. Consider this, Webb began, writing equations on a whiteboard as he spoke. We know from quantum mechanics that observation affects reality. The famous double-slit experiment demonstrates that particles behave differently when observed versus when unobserved. Now extend that principle to a macroscopic scale and to time itself. What if certain locations, under specific conditions, create what we might call thin spots in space-time? Points where the barrier between different temporal periods becomes permeable? You're suggesting that RAF Framingham is such a location? Dr. Brennan asked. Not permanently, Webb clarified, but perhaps transiently under specific conditions. Consider the emotional and historical weight of that place. Thousands of young men passed through there, many to their deaths. The land is saturated with human experience, with powerful emotions. What if that somehow affects the quantum structure of space-time itself? And what if Thomas Mitchell, with his deep personal connection to his ancestor and his intense focus on trying to visualize the past, somehow resonated with that emotional weight? Dr. Goldstein, the materials scientist, looked skeptical. You're proposing that human emotion can affect the structure of time? That's not physics, that's mysticism. Is it? Webb countered. We don't actually understand the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics. The measurement problem, the question of how quantum states collapse into classical reality, remains unsolved. We know that observation matters, but we don't know why or how. What if consciousness, particularly intense focused consciousness, can interact with quantum fields in ways we don't yet understand? What if, in rare circumstances and specific locations, that interaction can create temporal discontinuities? As winter approached in late 2022, the investigation had reached a curious impasse. The team had established to their satisfaction that the photograph was genuine, that Thomas Mitchell was indeed the figure in the background, and that some form of temporal anomaly had occurred. But they were no closer to understanding the mechanism by which Thomas had appeared in 1942, or why this particular intersection of past and present had occurred. Then Dr. Yamamoto discovered something in the archival records that transformed their understanding of the entire mystery. While researching James Mitchell's military service, Yamamoto had obtained copies of every letter Mitchell had written home to his family during his time in England. Most of these letters had been preserved by Mitchell's mother, Dorothy, then passed down through the family. They were standard wartime correspondence, reassurances that he was well, carefully censored descriptions of life on the airbase, expressions of homesickness and longing for the familiar landscapes of Kansas. But one letter written on March 14, 1942, the day before the photograph was taken, contained a passage that made Yamamoto immediately call an emergency meeting of the entire research team. The letter began with the usual pleasantries and reassurances. Then came this paragraph. "Something strange happened to me today, Ma, and I know you'll think I've gone mad from the stress of it all, but I need to tell someone. I was standing outside our barracks this afternoon, watching the ground crew work on the planes, and I saw someone who didn't belong there. He was standing near the tail of one of the fortresses, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, and he was dressed all wrong. Civilian clothes, not like anything anyone here wears. And he was holding something up to his face, something small that I couldn't quite make out. I only saw him for a second or two. I blinked and he was gone. But in that moment I could have sworn he looked familiar somehow. Like I should know him but didn't. Like family, almost. I asked some of the other fellows if they'd seen anyone, but nobody knew what I was talking about. They said I was seeing things, that maybe I should talk to the flight surgeon about nerves. But I know what I saw, Ma. I don't know what it means, but I saw someone who shouldn't have been there." The letter continued with other topics, but that single paragraph changed everything. James Mitchell had seen Thomas Mitchell before the photograph was taken. The temporal anomaly had not been a single instantaneous event, but an ongoing phenomenon that both men had experienced from their different points in time. "This suggests something remarkable," Dr. Webb said, his excitement evident despite his usual scientific caution. The temporal intersection was bidirectional. James saw Thomas in March 1942. Thomas experienced unusual phenomena in October 2019, and the photograph captured the moment when the barrier between their respective times was at its thinnest. But it also suggests that the anomaly persisted over time, or rather, over times. The photograph was taken the day after James's sighting, which means the temporal permeability lasted at least 2 days from James's perspective. Dr. Brennan had been studying the letter intensely since Yamamoto had presented it. Notice how James describes Thomas. Like family, almost. He sensed the connection even though he couldn't possibly have known that Thomas was his great-great-nephew. That supports Dr. Webb's hypothesis about emotional and genetic connections, somehow facilitating temporal anomalies. Thomas Mitchell himself sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Finally he spoke, his voice unsteady. "He saw me. James saw me. When I was standing there in 2019 thinking I was alone, trying to connect with his memory, he was actually there on the other side of whatever barrier separates our times. And he recognized me somehow. We recognized each other." Over the following weeks, the team pursued this new line of investigation with renewed energy. They interviewed Thomas extensively about his family background and his relationship to his ancestors' memory. Thomas revealed that he had felt drawn to James Mitchell's story from childhood. His grandmother, Walter Mitchell's daughter, had told him stories about the young uncle who had died in the war before she was born. She had shown him photographs, including a few that had survived from James's time in Kansas before the war. "I used to dream about him," Thomas admitted during one interview session. "Not nightmares exactly, but vivid dreams where I was there in England during the war. I could see the airfield, the planes, the men in their flight gear. I always thought it was just my imagination fueled by all the war movies and history books I consumed. But now I wonder if it was something more. Some kind of connection across time." Dr. Chen conducted a detailed facial recognition analysis, comparing photographs of James Mitchell with photographs of Thomas Mitchell. Despite the 77 years separating them and the intervening generations, the genetic resemblance was striking. The basic facial architecture was remarkably similar. The same bone structure, the same spacing of features, even similar mannerisms evident in candid photographs. Genetics might be more significant than we initially thought, Chen reported. Thomas carries James's genetic legacy through the male Mitchell line. We know that certain physical traits can persist across generations with remarkable fidelity. What if quantum entanglement, the phenomenon where particles remain connected across vast distances, has some analog in genetic relationships? What if the shared DNA created a kind of resonance that facilitated the temporal connection? Dr. Webb was intrigued by this suggestion but cautioned against overinterpretation. We're in danger of constructing a theory that explains everything but predicts nothing. Science requires testable hypotheses. How would we test whether genetic relationships facilitate temporal anomalies? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Brennan, reviewing the complete photographic archive from the 391st Bombardment Group, discovered 3 other photographs that, upon careful examination and digital enhancement, appeared to contain similar anomalies. In each case, there were figures in the background, barely visible in the original images but revealed through modern restoration techniques, that appeared to be dressed in contemporary rather than period clothing. The team immediately began investigating these additional photographs. They identified the primary subjects in each image and began tracing their descendants, looking for any who might have visited the RAF Framingham site in the decades since the war ended. The process was laborious and time-consuming, but by January 2023, they had identified 2 potential matches. One was Martha Steinberg, 63, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio, who had visited England in 2015. She was the granddaughter of Lieutenant Robert Steinberg, a navigator who appeared in one of the anomalous photographs taken in April 1942. When shown the enhanced image, Martha became emotional. "That's me," she confirmed. "I was there in 2015. I stood in that exact spot trying to feel close to my grandfather, and I took pictures, just like that, with my phone." By early 2023, Dr. Brennan's research team had documented 7 distinct cases of temporal anomalies in photographs from RAF Framingham between 1942 and 1945. In each case, the pattern was identical: a serviceman photographed at the base during the war years, a descendant who visited the site decades later with a deep emotional connection to their ancestor, and photographic evidence suggesting the 2 had somehow shared a moment across the decades that separated them. The team's findings, while still unpublished and classified as preliminary research, began to attract attention from other academic institutions. By March 2023, researchers from MIT, Stanford, Cambridge, and the Max Planck Institute had requested permission to review the evidence and contribute their own expertise. Dr. Brennan, initially protective of the research, realized that the implications were too profound for any single team to handle alone. She began organizing what she called the Temporal Anomaly Research Consortium, a collaborative effort involving more than 50 researchers from a dozen institutions across 3 continents. The consortium's first major meeting took place in Washington, D.C., in April 2023. Over 3 intensive days, researchers presented their analyses, debated methodologies, and attempted to construct a coherent theoretical framework that could account for the observations. The discussions were often contentious, with physicists clashing with historians, skeptics challenging believers, and everyone struggling to reconcile the evidence with their understanding of how reality operates. Dr. Marcus Webb presented a refined version of his temporal permeability hypothesis. He proposed that certain locations, particularly those associated with intense human emotion and significant historical events, could develop what he termed temporal resonance zones. In these zones, the normal linear progression of time remained intact, but under specific circumstances, particularly when someone with a strong genetic and emotional connection to the past focused their consciousness on that past, brief windows could open, allowing limited perception and even photographic documentation across temporal boundaries. Think of time as normally being like a solid wall, Webb explained using a large diagram he had prepared. Completely impermeable. But temporal resonance zones are like that wall becoming translucent, almost like frosted glass. You can't walk through it, but under the right lighting conditions you might glimpse shadows on the other side. And if you have a camera pointed at exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment, you might capture an image of what's on the other side. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist from CERN who had joined the consortium, proposed an alternative explanation grounded in quantum field theory. What if we're seeing evidence of what some theorists call quantum shadows? Information from alternative quantum states bleeding through into our observable reality. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every quantum event creates branching universes. Perhaps what we're documenting isn't time travel in any conventional sense, but rather a glimpse into parallel timelines that diverged from our own decades ago, but remain quantum entangled at specific locations. The debate between Webb's temporal permeability model and Vasquez's quantum shadow hypothesis dominated much of the conference. Both explanations had strengths and weaknesses. Both required accepting phenomena that conventional physics considered impossible, or at least highly improbable. But both offered testable predictions that could potentially be verified through careful observation. Meanwhile, Thomas Mitchell had become something of a celebrity within the research community, though the team maintained strict confidentiality agreements preventing any public disclosure. His experience represented the most thoroughly documented case of the phenomenon. He had not only appeared in the 1942 photograph, but he could provide detailed testimony about his subjective experience during the temporal intersection. Working with Dr. Yamamoto and a team of cognitive psychologists, Thomas underwent hypnotic regression therapy, designed to help him recall every detail of his October 2019 visit to RAF Framingham. The sessions, conducted over several weeks in May 2023, revealed details that Thomas's conscious mind had dismissed or forgotten. "I remember now," Thomas said during one session, speaking in the slightly disconnected voice characteristic of hypnotic trance. "I was standing by the memorial. It was late afternoon, getting cold. I was looking at the names, trying to find James's name. And then the light changed. It became brighter, warmer, like summer instead of autumn. And I could hear voices, men's voices, American accents, talking and laughing. I turned around, and for just a moment, maybe only a second, I could see them. Not clearly like looking through fog or water, but I could see figures in flight suits and aircraft. The B-17 bombers. Right there where there should have been only empty fields." "What did you do?" Dr. Yamamoto asked softly. I raised my phone. I wanted to capture it. I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining it. And then one of the airmen, turned and looked right at me. Young face, scared eyes. He could see me too, I think. We saw each other across whatever separated us. And then it was gone. Just autumn fields again, and I was alone. And I thought I had imagined the whole thing." "Did you recognize the airman who looked at you?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he finally whispered. "It was James. It was my great-great-uncle James. I knew his face from the photographs. It was him." When Thomas was brought out of the hypnotic state, he was emotionally shaken, but also relieved. "I'm not crazy," he said. "This really happened. We really saw each other." The psychological team analyzing Thomas's testimony noted the profound emotional component of his experience. This aligned with the emerging consensus among the consortium researchers that emotional connection was somehow crucial to the phenomenon. Pure historical curiosity did not seem sufficient to trigger temporal intersections. The documented cases all involved descendants with deep, personal connections to their ancestors. People who had grown up hearing stories, who had felt the absence of family members lost to war, who carried both genetic heritage and emotional legacy. In June 2023, the consortium made a decision that would prove controversial among its members. They would attempt to deliberately trigger a temporal anomaly. Dr. Brennan initially opposed the idea, arguing that they didn't understand the phenomenon well enough to experiment safely. But others argued that without experimental verification, they would remain stuck in endless theoretical speculation. The experiment was carefully designed. They selected Rebecca Santos, 34, granddaughter of Technical Sergeant Miguel Santos, a radio operator who had served with the 391st Bombardment Group and appeared in photographs from May 1943. Rebecca had volunteered for the project after learning about the research. She had visited RAF Framingham twice before, in 2018 and 2021, though no anomalies had been documented during those visits. The experimental protocol was straightforward but emotionally demanding. Rebecca would visit the site on May 17, 2023, exactly 80 years to the day after a photograph had been taken of her grandfather. She would stand in the same location where he had stood, as closely as they could determine from historical records and photographic analysis. She would bring personal items that had belonged to Miguel, his service medals, a letter he had written to his wife, a photograph of him with his crew. And she would focus her consciousness as intensely as possible on connecting with her grandfather's memory. The team set up an array of monitoring equipment unprecedented in paranormal research. High-resolution cameras recorded from multiple angles. Electromagnetic sensors tracked any fluctuations in the local fields. Quantum entanglement detectors, experimental devices that Dr. Vasquez had brought from CERN, attempted to measure any anomalous quantum correlations. Even atmospheric sensors recorded temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. Rebecca arrived at the site at 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the same time the original photograph had been taken. She was visibly nervous but determined. The research team maintained their positions around the perimeter, careful not to interfere but ready to document anything unusual. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. Rebecca stood near the memorial, holding her grandfather's medals, speaking softly about her memories of the stories her mother had told her about Miguel. The monitoring equipment registered nothing abnormal. Then at 1432, the electromagnetic sensors began registering fluctuations. Small at first, then increasingly pronounced. The quantum detectors showed correlations that Dr. Vasquez would later describe as statistically impossible. We were seeing entanglement patterns that should not exist in a classical macroscopic system. Rebecca's demeanor changed. She became very still, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. Later, she would report that at that moment she heard aircraft engines, the same deep rumbling that Thomas Mitchell had described. And voices. Men speaking in English. American voices, overlaid with static like an old radio transmission. The cameras captured what happened next. For approximately 7 seconds, confirmed by multiple synchronized recordings, the air around Rebecca appeared to shimmer like heat distortion on a summer highway. The light quality changed, becoming simultaneously brighter and hazier. And in that shimmer, barely visible but definitely present in the recordings, shapes appeared. Indistinct, ghostly, but unmistakably human figures and structures that were not present in the modern landscape. Then it was over. The shimmer dissipated. Rebecca staggered slightly and 2 team members rushed forward to support her. She was pale and trembling but conscious and coherent. "I saw him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I saw Grandpa Miguel. He was young, so young, younger than I am now. And he saw me. He smiled at me. He knew who I was somehow. I could feel it. And then he was gone." The successful experimental triggering of a temporal anomaly sent shockwaves through the consortium. What had been theoretical speculation now became documented fact. Under specific conditions, the barrier between past and present could become permeable. The implications were staggering not just for physics and history, but for philosophy, theology, and humanity's understanding of its place in time. Dr. Brennan spent the weeks following the experiment writing and rewriting a preliminary report. The challenge was presenting findings that contradicted established physics without sounding like a work of science fiction. She consulted with senior physicists, historians, and even philosophers, trying to find language that would communicate both the extraordinary nature of the observations and the rigorous methodology that had produced them. "We're not claiming to have discovered time travel," she explained during a video conference with Dr. Webb and Dr. Vasquez in July 2023. We're documenting something more subtle and possibly more profound. These aren't physical journeys through time. No one is moving from one era to another, but information is crossing temporal boundaries. Observation is occurring across decades, and that alone requires us to fundamentally reconsider our assumptions about the nature of time and causality. Dr. Webb had been developing mathematical models to describe the phenomenon. His equations, he admitted, were provisional and incomplete, but they suggested something remarkable. If temporal permeability is real, he explained, then time may not be the simple one-directional flow we've always assumed. It might be more like a landscape with varying topology. Most places, most times, are isolated from each other by vast distances in temporal space. But certain locations, under certain conditions, might be temporal peaks or valleys, where the distance between different eras becomes vanishingly small. This prospect horrified many consortium members. Dr. Vasquez argued passionately that scientific discovery must remain open and transparent. If we allow this research to be classified, we'll never know if we're being manipulated, if our findings are being suppressed or distorted for political or military purposes. Science only works when it's subjected to peer review and public scrutiny, but others, including Dr. Chen, suggested that caution might be warranted. If temporal perception can be deliberately triggered, what might happen if this knowledge falls into the wrong hands? Could authoritarian regimes use it for surveillance, observing dissidents in the past to predict their behavior in the present? Could intelligence agencies weaponize it? We have an ethical obligation to consider the consequences of our discoveries. The debate was still ongoing when something happened that rendered it temporarily moot. In September 2023, a prominent science journalist named David Chen, no relation to Dr. Harold Chen, published an article in The Atlantic titled, "The Ghosts of RAF Framingham. Has Science Discovered Evidence of Time Perception?" The article was careful, well-researched, and maddeningly accurate. Someone, despite all the confidentiality agreements, had leaked information about the consortium's research. The article created an immediate media sensation. Within days, news organizations around the world were running stories about time-traveling photographs and ghosts in the machine. The coverage ranged from thoughtful scientific journalism to sensationalistic tabloid speculation. Suddenly, RAF Framingham was inundated with visitors hoping to experience their own temporal anomalies. The small museum at the site was overwhelmed. Local residents complained about the disruption. Dr. Brennan found herself thrust into the uncomfortable position of public spokesperson for research she had hoped to keep confidential until it was ready for formal peer review. She gave interviews to major news outlets, always emphasizing the preliminary nature of the findings and the need for caution in interpretation. But she couldn't control the narrative. The story had taken on a life of its own. "Scientists may have photographed the past," proclaimed one headline. "Time travel proven real," claimed another. "Ghost photos baffle experts," announced a third. The actual research, careful, methodical, uncertain, was lost in the rush of sensationalism. Thomas Mitchell, too, found himself suddenly famous. His identity had been protected in Chen's original article, but within weeks, internet sleuths had identified him. He began receiving hundreds of messages daily, some supportive, many hostile, others simply curious. Conspiracy theorists claimed he was part of an elaborate hoax. Religious fundamentalists accused him of trafficking with demons. New Age enthusiasts insisted he was proof of psychic phenomena. Scientists who had not seen the evidence dismissed the entire affair as either fraud or misinterpretation. The attention took a severe toll on Thomas's mental health. By October 2023, he had withdrawn from public life, refusing interviews and limiting his communication to the core research team. "I just wanted to honor my great-great-uncle's memory," he told Dr. Yamamoto during one of their regular counseling sessions. "I never wanted to become the face of some controversial scientific theory. I never wanted to be called a liar or a fraud or a tool of Satan. I just wanted to understand what happened to James." The consortium attempted to continue its work amid the media circus, but the environment had fundamentally changed. Funding agencies, once supportive, now worried about reputational damage from association with research that had become tabloid fodder. Some consortium members, facing professional ridicule, withdrew from the project. Others doubled down, arguing that the public attention, however uncomfortable, validated the importance of the research. In November 2023, Dr. Brennan and the remaining core team published their findings in a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Anomalous Physics, a relatively new publication willing to consider unconventional research. The paper, titled Documented Cases of Temporal Perception Anomalies at Historical Sites, Photographic Evidence and Proposed Mechanisms, was careful, methodical, and conservative in its conclusions. It presented the evidence, described the methodology, acknowledged the limitations, and proposed several possible theoretical frameworks without endorsing any single explanation. The response from the scientific community was mixed. Some researchers praised the rigor of the methodology, even while remaining skeptical of the conclusions. Others dismissed the entire work as pseudoscience dressed in academic language. A few, mostly younger researchers less invested in defending established paradigms, expressed cautious support and called for additional research. Dr. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, a physicist from Oxford who had initially been skeptical but had joined the consortium after reviewing the evidence, wrote a defense of the research in Nature that December. Whether or not the proposed mechanisms are correct, she argued, the photographic evidence is genuine and demands explanation. We cannot dismiss observations simply because they challenge our current theoretical frameworks. That way lies intellectual stagnation. Science advances by confronting anomalies, not by pretending they don't exist. While the scientific debate raged, Dr. Yamamoto and his team of historians had been pursuing a different question. Why RAF Framingham? Why did this particular location seem to facilitate temporal anomalies when thousands of other wartime sites showed no such phenomena? The answer, they discovered, lay in the particular intensity of experience concentrated at that location during a relatively brief period. RAF Framingham had been operational as an American bomber base from February 1942 through June 1945, roughly 3.5 years. During that time, more than 4,000 American airmen had passed through the base. Of those, more than 600 had been killed in combat or in training accidents. The casualty rate was approximately 15%, high even by the brutal standards of the strategic bombing campaign. But numbers alone didn't tell the complete story. Yamamoto and his colleagues conducted oral history interviews with the few surviving veterans from the base, now in their late 90s or early hundreds. What emerged was a portrait of a place where the boundary between life and death, hope and despair had been terrifyingly thin. Every mission was a coin flip, said Arthur Holbrook, a former pilot who had flown 32 missions from Framingham and survived the war. Interviewed in his nursing home in December 2023 at age 101, Holbrook spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades thinking about his experiences. You'd take off in the morning and you never knew if you'd be back for supper. Some crews didn't come back. Their bunks would be stripped and reassigned before their planes hit the ground. We lived in this strange state of suspended reality, where tomorrow was never guaranteed. The psychological pressure, Holbrook explained, created an intense focus on the present moment. You couldn't think about next month or next year. You could barely think about tomorrow. All you had was right now, this moment, this breath. It made everything, every conversation, every meal, every letter home, feel both more precious and more unreal, like we were ghosts already, haunting our own lives. This testimony resonated with Dr. Webb's theoretical framework. If consciousness focused intensely on the present moment could somehow affect temporal perception, then RAF Framingham in the early 1940s would have been saturated with such consciousness. Thousands of young men acutely aware of their mortality, living each day as if it might be their last, creating an emotional resonance that might somehow have imprinted itself on the location itself. Dr. Rebecca Wu, the cultural historian who had joined the consortium early on, proposed what she called the emotional archaeology hypothesis. Just as physical objects leave traces that archaeologists can excavate centuries later, she explained in a January 2024 lecture, perhaps intense emotional experiences leave traces in the quantum structure of spacetime itself. Not physical traces, but informational ones. And perhaps, under the right conditions, those informational traces can be accessed, perceived, even photographed by people who share a resonant emotional connection to the original experiences. This hypothesis gained support from an unexpected source. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a neuroscientist from Kyoto University, who had been studying the neural basis of memory and emotion, joined the consortium in early 2024. His research had shown that memories with strong emotional components created more persistent and widespread neural patterns than neutral memories. He proposed that something analogous might occur at a macro scale. Think of the brain as a kind of biological quantum computer, Tanaka explained. Emotionally charged memories create coherent quantum states across large numbers of neurons. These states are more stable and more easily recalled than neutral memories. What if locations where intense emotions were concentrated can develop similar coherent states in their local quantum fields? What if places can remember, in a sense, just as brains remember? The team began investigating whether other historical sites showed evidence of similar phenomena. They identified several candidates: battlefields from major conflicts, concentration camps from the Holocaust, sites of natural disasters that had killed large numbers of people. In each case, they looked for anecdotal reports of anomalous experiences, feelings of presence, unexplained sounds or images, photographs with strange artifacts. What they found was suggestive but not conclusive. Many historical sites had long-standing traditions of ghost sightings and paranormal reports, but most of these reports, when carefully investigated, proved to be either hoaxes, misidentifications of natural phenomena, or psychological projections. The RAF Framingham case remained unique in having clear photographic documentation and the ability to identify specific individuals across the temporal boundary. However, the team did discover one additional site that showed promising evidence: the United States Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, the famous sculpture depicting the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. Several visitors to the memorial over the years had reported seeing figures in World War II-era Marine Corps uniforms in their photographs, figures that had not been visible when the photographs were taken. Most of these reports had been dismissed as wishful thinking or photographic artifacts, but when Dr. Chen applied the same enhancement techniques used on the RAF Framingham photographs to images from the Iwo Jima memorial, he found 3 cases that appeared genuine. In each case, the anomalous figures could be tentatively identified as descendants of Marines who had died during the battle for Iwo Jima, descendants who had visited the memorial to honor their ancestors. We may be looking at a broader phenomenon than we initially realized, Dr. Brennan told the consortium during a meeting in February 2024. Not just RAF Framingham, but potentially any location where intense human experience has been concentrated, where many people died or suffered or experienced profound emotion, and where descendants or others with strong emotional connections later visit. The conditions that create temporal permeability may be rare, but they may not be unique. This realization brought new urgency to the research. If the phenomenon was more widespread than initially believed, the implications multiplied. How many other photographs in archives around the world might contain similar anomalies, waiting to be revealed by modern enhancement technology? How many people had experienced temporal perceptions without understanding what they were experiencing? And most significantly, if the phenomenon could be deliberately triggered, as the experiment with Rebecca Santos had demonstrated, what would be the ethical and practical implications? By spring of 2024, 2 years after the initial discovery of the anomaly in Sergeant Mitchell's photograph, the consortium had documented 43 cases of potential temporal anomalies at 17 different locations around the world. The research had spawned numerous subfields: temporal physics, consciousness studies, genetic genealogy as it related to temporal perception, and what Dr. Wu called emotional archaeology, the study of how human experience might leave measurable traces in physical space. The work remained controversial. Mainstream physics journals continued to reject papers on the topic, citing insufficient theoretical foundation, but the evidence kept accumulating. More descendants came forward with their own experiences. More photographs revealed anomalies when subjected to modern analysis. The phenomenon might not be understood, but it could no longer be easily dismissed. Thomas Mitchell had found a measure of peace with his role in the discovery. In April 2024, he published a memoir titled, A Moment Across Time, My Encounter with My Great-Great-Uncle in Wartime England. The book was part personal history, part meditation on memory and family, part attempt to explain the inexplicable. It became a surprising bestseller, not because it provided answers, but because it asked questions that resonated with many people's own experiences of feeling connected across time to ancestors they had never met. I don't know what happened to me in October 2019, Thomas wrote in the book's conclusion. I don't know how I appeared in a photograph taken 33 years before I was born. The scientists have their theories, and those theories may someday be proven correct or incorrect. But what I know, what I feel in my bones, is that for one brief moment, James and I saw each other across the decades. Two men separated by death and time but connected by blood and memory. And in that moment I understood something fundamental. The past isn't really past. The dead aren't really gone. They exist in a different relationship to time than we do, but they exist. And sometimes, under the right conditions, we can reach across the barrier that separates us and touch, just for an instant, the hands of those who came before. Dr. Brennan retired from the National Archives in June 2024, but she continued working with the consortium as a senior advisor. Looking back on the 2 years since the discovery, she reflected on how the research had changed, not just her understanding of physics and history, but her understanding of human existence itself. We set out to explain a photographic anomaly, she said during her retirement lecture. We ended up confronting fundamental questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and human connection. We still don't have definitive answers. Perhaps we never will. But we've documented something real, something that challenges our assumptions about how reality works. And that, ultimately, is what science is supposed to do, not confirm what we already believe, but reveal truths we didn't expect. The RAF Framingham Memorial became something more than a historical site. It became a pilgrimage destination for descendants of the men who had served there, people hoping for their own moments of connection across time. The small museum expanded to accommodate the visitors. The local community, initially overwhelmed by the attention, eventually embraced their role as guardians of this unusual place. Dr. Webb continued developing his theoretical models, publishing a comprehensive framework for understanding temporal permeability in March 2025. His work, while still not accepted by mainstream physics, attracted a new generation of young researchers willing to explore unconventional ideas. Several universities established research programs dedicated to studying temporal anomalies, consciousness, and the relationship between human experience and space-time structure. As for James Robert Mitchell himself, the young bombardier who had posed before his B-17 bomber on that March morning in 1942, who had written to his mother about seeing someone who shouldn't have been there, who had died 5 months later over the cold waters of the Atlantic. His story became known far beyond the small circle of military historians who had previously been aware of him. His name was added to curriculum materials about World War II. Schools taught about him not just as a casualty of war, but as an unexpected participant in one of the most profound scientific discoveries of the 21st century. His photograph became iconic, not just a historical document but a window into mysteries that science was only beginning to explore. On June 23, 2024, exactly 82 years after James Mitchell's final mission, Thomas Mitchell stood at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, before the tablets of the missing, where James's name was inscribed. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling the carved letters beneath his fingers. Around him, unseen by normal vision but perhaps present nonetheless, the past and present overlapped. The cemetery existed in multiple times simultaneously, as it was in 2024, peaceful and solemn, as it was being constructed in the late 1940s, when the full scale of the war's losses was finally being counted, and perhaps in some quantum shadow, as it existed in the consciousness of all those who had mourned there over the decades, their grief and memory creating layers of emotional resonance that persisted independent of linear time. Thomas closed his eyes and thought about his great-great-uncle, about a young man who had wanted to survive the war, marry his girlfriend, buy a farm in Kansas, raise children who would never know what war was like. A young man whose dreams had died with him in the sky over France, whose body had never been recovered, whose sacrifice had been noted in official records, but whose individual story had nearly been forgotten. Until a photograph taken on March 15, 1942, had been digitally restored 80 years later, and revealed a mystery that would force humanity to reconsider its understanding of time itself. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and flowers. And for just a moment, perhaps imagination, perhaps something more, Thomas thought he heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines, not the high whine of modern jets, but the deep, pulsing roar of Wright cyclone radial engines, the sound that had filled the skies over England in the dark years of the war. He opened his eyes. The cemetery was peaceful and empty except for a few other visitors in the distance. The only sound was the wind and the birds. But Thomas smiled anyway, feeling a connection across time that needed no scientific explanation, that existed independent of temporal permeability or quantum entanglement or any of the theories that sought to explain the inexplicable. "I remember you," he whispered to the name carved in stone. "You're not forgotten. You never will be." And somewhere, in some configuration of space-time that human understanding could not quite grasp, perhaps James Robert Mitchell, or the informational echo of who he had been, the quantum shadow of his consciousness that persisted in the structure of reality, heard those words and was comforted. The past and present touched, just for an instant in the only way they ever could, through memory, through love, through the stubborn human refusal to let death and time have the final word. And in that touching time itself, linear, implacable, indifferent seemed to bend just slightly, just enough to allow two men separated by 8 decades to know, across all the years that divided them, that they were family, that they were connected, that they were not alone. The story that had begun with a photograph taken in wartime would continue long after those directly involved had passed into history themselves. The research would go on, new cases would be documented, theories would be refined or discarded. Perhaps, someday, humanity would fully understand how consciousness and emotion could bridge the gap between past and present. Or perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries, pointing toward truths that could be experienced but never fully explained, felt but never fully understood, truths about the nature of time, the persistence of memory, and the enduring power of human connection across all the barriers that seek to separate us. In the end, the photograph of Technical Sergeant James Robert Mitchell standing before his B-17 bomber on March 15, 1942, with a figure from the future barely visible in the background, became more than just evidence of temporal anomaly. It became a symbol of something fundamental about human existence. We are all connected across time, to those who came before and those who will come after. We are all part of a story larger than our individual lives. And sometimes, if conditions are right and the barriers grow thin, we might glimpse that larger story and understand, just for a moment, our place within it. The photograph hangs now in the National Archives, carefully preserved, available for researchers to study. But its true home is in the imagination and memory of everyone who has ever wondered about their ancestors, everyone who has ever felt the pull of history, everyone who has ever stood in a place where significant events occurred and felt, however briefly, that the past was not quite as past as it should be. James Mitchell got his wish in a way. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his life to matter. And through the inexplicable accident of temporal permeability, through the determination of a descendant who refused to let his memory fade, through the dedication of scientists willing to follow evidence wherever it led, his story became immortal, not in the way he might have imagined, but immortal nonetheless. And that perhaps is enough.